My name is Joanna Miles. I'm 26, and if there's one thing I've learned about my family, it's this. Image comes first, truth comes last, and I'm always the one who pays the price for that order. I wasn't surprised when people laughed at me. I grew up surrounded by it. The lingering glances, the subtle smirks, the looks that quietly suggested I should try harder to blend in, to shrink parts of myself that didn't fit neatly into their idea of acceptable. But nothing prepared me for the moment a man who barely knew me, my sister's new boyfriend, leaned back in his chair during a family dinner and casually asked if I was still unemployed, as if it were the punchline to a joke he'd been holding on to all night. Everyone laughed. My dad even nodded, like he agreed with the premise. For a split second, I nearly let it pass. I nearly swallowed it the way I always had, tucked the discomfort away and smiled through it. But humiliation has a way of arriving when you're finally too tired to pretend it doesn't hurt. And sometimes, the person who believes they're the smartest one in the room ends up revealing far more than they ever intended. Because as he kept talking, confident and dismissive, he mentioned something that didn't align. Something that made my chest tighten and my breath catch for half a second. Something he should never have said in front of me. I didn't confront him that night. I didn't interrupt or raise my voice. I didn't challenge him or correct him. I simply listened. I watched him perform. I let everyone enjoy their laughter, let the moment pass exactly as they expected it to. I waited, quietly and patiently, for the point where his own words would eventually find their way back to him. And when they did, the color drained from their faces. Before I tell you what he said and what happened after I walked out, tell me what time it is for you right now and where you're watching from. I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. The dinner itself took place on a quiet Sunday evening. I drove back to my parents' house with that familiar tension tightening my chest, the same feeling that always surfaced the moment I entered their neighborhood. The street looked unchanged, frozen in time. Neatly trimmed lawns, identical mailboxes, houses standing shoulder to shoulder, all pretending nothing unpleasant ever occurred behind their carefully maintained fronts. The illusion was flawless, rigid, almost impressive in its consistency. I parked, inhaled slowly, and stepped inside. My mother stood at the kitchen island arranging plates with deliberate precision, like she was staging a display rather than preparing a meal. She greeted me with a smile that felt practiced, more obligation than affection. She didn't ask how I'd been. She asked why I was cutting it so close, as though arriving minutes before dinner hinted at a deeper personal failing. I was used to comments that hovered between courtesy and criticism. They always landed in the same place. I was tolerated, never genuinely welcomed. My father sat at the table sorting through a stack of mail, barely lifting his eyes when I entered. He acknowledged me with a brief nod, just enough to avoid appearing impolite. There was no warmth in it, no sign that my presence mattered. I took my seat quietly, as I always did, settling into the role that required the least attention. Not long after, my sister arrived, wearing her polished smile, followed closely by her boyfriend, Evan Carter. He entered the room like it was already his stage. It was the first time I'd seen him with the entire family present, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who assumed approval was inevitable. My parents visibly brightened, straightening in their seats, their expressions softening in a way I rarely saw directed at me. No explanation was necessary. He was exactly the kind of person they wanted associated with the family. Once we sat down, conversation flowed around me rather than toward me. My mother asked Evan about his week, laughing too enthusiastically at stories that weren't particularly interesting. My father encouraged him to elaborate on his work, nodding along as though he understood every detail. My sister watched with satisfaction as attention settled naturally on Evan, pleased with how seamlessly he fit into the picture she wanted to present. I kept my focus on my plate, aware that I was sitting inside a performance I hadn't agreed to participate in. Occasionally, my mother glanced at me, checking to see if I planned to contribute something impressive. My father seemed relieved every time I stayed quiet. The dynamic wasn't unfamiliar, but that night it felt sharper, as if everyone had silently agreed that I shouldn't disrupt the image they were cultivating. Inevitably, the attention shifted to me. It always did. Not out of curiosity, but out of routine. My family had perfected the art of examining my life under the pretense of casual conversation, searching for updates that confirmed what they already believed. Progress, to them, was measured only in titles, salaries, promotions, milestones they could proudly repeat to others. Anything outside that narrow definition was treated as failure. So when Evan turned to me, it felt expected. His tone was light, almost friendly, but underneath sat an assumption he'd already settled on. He asked about my work, and I answered plainly, offering no embellishment. I watched his expression shift, subtle but telling. My mother shifted uncomfortably. My father's jaw tightened. My sister focused on her plate. No one said anything, but the silence carried their disappointment clearly enough. Evan took that moment as an opening. He leaned back, speaking easily about his projects, his connections, his ambitions. Each sentence positioned him as capable, successful, impressive. My family listened intently, absorbing every word as further proof that he belonged. I listened too, not reacting, not interrupting. And while nothing dramatic happened in that moment, something lodged itself in my awareness. The way he described his work, the terminology he used, the organizations he referenced casually. One detail didn't quite align with the role he claimed to hold. It was small, something most people would miss. I didn't comment on it, I simply remembered it. As dessert was served, the energy at the table shifted. Conversation slowed, laughter softened, and the night seemed to settle into what everyone else had been waiting for. Evan leaned forward again, comfortable, confident. He made a remark about ambition, vague enough to sound harmless, sharp enough to land exactly where he intended. My mother laughed first, polite and encouraging. My father followed. My sister smiled faintly. Evan continued, speaking about people who drifted, people who took too long to find direction, people who talked about work without actually having it. The laughter grew louder. I felt each sound land with a familiar sting, mockery disguised as bonding. I stayed silent. Then he turned to me fully and asked if I still had a lot of free time during the day. The phrasing was gentle, the implication unmistakable. My mother sighed softly. My father stirred his drink. The message was clear, the same one I'd heard my entire life. Contribute more, achieve more, be more presentable. I stayed silent. Not out of weakness, but because silence allowed me to study every detail without drawing attention. Evan's confidence grew with each passing minute. He talked about strategies, responsibilities, meetings with executives. He layered his stories with jargon and vague references, enough to impress anyone who didn't understand the terms. But something about his explanations felt too smooth, too curated, like he had memorized pieces from different sources and stitched them into a persona he wanted others to see. I didn't call him out, didn't question anything. I simply listened, observed, memorized. By the time dessert was served, the table was fully committed to the illusion of Evan's success, his intelligence, his stability. But beneath the surface of his words, I recognized a pattern, details that didn't align, descriptions that contradicted the earlier ones, claims that felt strangely empty. I didn't know exactly what was wrong yet, but I knew one thing. His story wasn't as airtight as he wanted everyone to believe, and that quiet realization changed everything. The days that followed moved with an unusual heaviness. I returned home after the dinner feeling drained in a way that didn't fade overnight. It wasn't exhaustion, it was a mental residue left behind from being pushed into a familiar role, the one where I was expected to absorb the laughter, the judgment, the subtle ways my family measured worth. Yet this time, something lingered beneath the surface, something sharper than embarrassment or frustration. It was curiosity, the kind that doesn't go away once it settles in. The first inconsistency I noticed during dinner replayed itself in my mind the next morning, looping quietly while I made coffee. Evan had described responsibilities that didn't exist in the department he claimed to work in, at least not in the structure I knew from my own experience in consulting circles. At first, I wondered if he'd simply exaggerated to impress my parents, but the more I thought about it, the more the pieces refused to fit. Still, suspicion alone wasn't enough to pursue anything. People embellish all the time, it wasn't unusual. But the certainty with which he talked, the performative precision, the broad statements reinforced with vague terminology, felt too deliberate. It nudged something in me, a sense that I hadn't been shown the full picture. A quiet afternoon arrived, and with it, space to think clearly. I sat on my couch, laptop closed, phone silent, replaying every detail I could remember from dinner. The way my mother leaned in when Evan spoke, the admiration in my father's nod, the way my sister's posture changed whenever he described his accomplishments. And woven into all of it was the contrast, their complete dismissal of me the moment Evan painted me as someone drifting without direction. That part shouldn't have mattered. I had long stopped seeking validation from them. But it wasn't their reaction that stayed with me. It was how confident Evan felt delivering a narrative that shifted the room instantly, a narrative he supported with statements that didn't align with what he claimed to be. So I started with the simplest step: research. I didn't dive into anything deep or invasive at first. Instead, I looked for public information, basic employment records, company structure, leadership names, published projects. Nothing was out of bounds. Everything was available to anyone willing to look, and ironically, the information I found didn't immediately confirm anything wrong. On paper, everything matched the image Evan presented, but the details he used during dinner didn't appear anywhere, not in job descriptions, not in team structures, not in the summaries of ongoing initiatives. They were pieces that existed in different roles, different divisions, different offices entirely. Even then, I tried to give him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he worked on cross-functional assignments. Maybe he had responsibilities not listed publicly. Maybe he embellished a little, but still stayed within the realm of truth. Yet the more I examined it, the more the gaps widened. A day later, I reached out to someone I knew from a previous contract. I didn't mention names, I didn't describe situations, I only asked a general question about workflow in that company's analytics wing. The answer came back quickly, clear, detailed, and completely incompatible with the story Evan had shared at dinner. That was when my curiosity sharpened into something else: resolve. I didn't know what I was looking for yet, but I knew where to start. Patterns don't reveal themselves in a single glance. They reveal themselves piece by piece, through inconsistencies that echo louder the more you notice them. Evan's stories had too many polished edges, too many phrases that sounded learned rather than lived, too many claims that shifted depending on the angle he presented them from. I spent the next evening reviewing everything with fresh focus. This wasn't paranoia, it wasn't jealousy, it wasn't a reaction to the insults he'd thrown at me. It was instinct, the same instinct that had guided me through complex analysis work, the instinct that noticed when something didn't add up, even if the discrepancy seemed minor. By the time the sun set, I felt something click quietly inside me. Evan wasn't just someone who exaggerated, he was someone who performed, and when performers rely on scripts, the truth always reveals itself the moment they step off the stage. I didn't confront anyone, not my family, not my sister, and certainly not Evan. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing, I didn't hint at anything. I simply allowed the questions to guide my next steps, knowing that the answers would come if I followed the inconsistencies to their source. And even though I didn't realize it then, everything that followed began with that single decision to look closer. The next step came quietly, almost without planning. It started with a simple message to Alex Newen, someone I had once collaborated with during a contracting assignment. Alex was the kind of person who remembered small details, the kind who could track down information without leaving traces. He wasn't a close friend, but he respected my work and trusted my judgment. When I asked if he had time to look into something, he didn't ask why, he only asked what I needed. I didn't give Evan's full story. I didn't mention my family, the dinner, or the insults. I kept it professional, just a name, a company, and a few vague questions about employment records. Alex agreed to check, said it might take a day or two, and that was enough. I closed my phone afterward and forced myself to step away from the situation, at least for a moment. But distance didn't quiet the thoughts. I found myself going back through everything I'd observed recently. There was a rhythm to Evan's behavior. He presented himself as someone important, someone whose presence automatically demanded respect. People responded to that confidence, my family included. The more I studied him, the clearer it became that he wasn't just maintaining an image, he was protecting it. The polished confidence, the curated stories, the seamless way he redirected questions, all pointed to someone who had rehearsed every version of himself before revealing it to others. The idea didn't make me angry, it made me focused. Late that evening, Alex sent a message saying he had found something unusual in public filings. Not illegal, not alarming, just strange. Evan's name appeared on paperwork linked to a small consulting entity registered out of a virtual office suite. The company had no website, no staff listings, no project history. It existed on paper and nowhere else. The discovery didn't surprise me, but it deepened my curiosity. People register small LLCs all the time, but when someone boasts about high-level responsibilities at a major firm while quietly attaching their name to a shell company with no activity, it raises questions about their intentions. It hinted at parallel work they didn't want tied to their main profile. I asked Alex to look deeper. He didn't hesitate. While waiting for his findings, I continued my own research. I searched for presentations Evan claimed to have given, conferences he said he attended, publications he referenced. None of it appeared anywhere, not even in the scattered corners of the internet where niche professional talks are usually archived. Every claim looked clean on the surface, but empty underneath, like a storefront with no inventory. The more I looked, the more the inconsistencies stacked on top of each other. The following day, Alex sent a longer update. He had managed to trace small transactions linked to the shell company, irregular deposits spaced across several months. The amounts varied, but they all appeared to come from personal accounts under different names. There was no indication of legitimate business activity, no invoices, no vendor listings, no corporate contracts. It resembled something informal, something built on promises rather than product. And suddenly, the memory of Evan describing private investor engagements during dinner made sense in a way I wished it didn't. He wasn't collaborating with anyone. He was collecting quietly from people who likely trusted him because he sounded knowledgeable enough to believe. I didn't jump to conclusions. I didn't assume criminal intent, but the pattern was clear. Evan wasn't the person he portrayed, and his professional identity leaned more on performance than actual work. That realization didn't bring satisfaction. It didn't feel like vindication. It felt like clarity, cold, steady clarity that settled somewhere deep inside my chest. I didn't tell my family. They wouldn't have listened, not without undeniable proof. My mother would have dismissed it as speculation. My father would have told me to stay out of it. My sister would have defended Evan because protecting the image mattered more than examining the truth. So I kept everything to myself. I reviewed every document Alex sent. I rewound every memory from that dinner. I pieced together every detail that hadn't made sense at the time, but now formed a coherent pattern. It wasn't just exaggeration. It wasn't harmless embellishment. It was fabrication, layered carefully over truth, polished until even he believed his own narrative. By the time I closed my laptop that night, one thing was certain. Whatever Evan was building behind the scenes, it wasn't stable, it wasn't sustainable, and it wasn't harmless. And whether my family wanted to face it or not, the truth was going to surface one way or another. The wedding invitation arrived sooner than I expected. A cream envelope with gold lettering appeared in my mailbox, carefully addressed as if formality could disguise everything underneath. I opened it without hesitation. My sister's name was printed across the top in elegant script, paired with Evan's in a matching font. The card listed a date, a venue, and a request for guests to attend a celebration of new beginnings. I stared at it longer than necessary, not out of sentiment, but out of a quiet awareness of what the event would become. The next day, I submitted my RSVP online. I marked attending, closed my laptop, and let the confirmation email sit unread. It wasn't an emotional decision. It wasn't driven by spite or a desire to disrupt anything. It was practical. If there was going to be a moment when all the pieces converged, it would be there, at the place where appearances mattered most to my family. Silence followed. My parents didn't reach out to ask if I planned to come. My sister didn't text to share excitement or logistical questions. They all moved forward with their lives as if the dinner never happened, as if the distance between us was something natural, rather than the result of choices made at that table. I didn't mind the quiet. It gave me space to think, to observe, to plan. A few days later, a message from Alex Nguyen appeared on my phone. He had found something new in the records, something that shifted the situation from suspicious to serious. I opened the file he sent, scrolling through transaction lists, timestamps, and spreadsheets he had reorganized for clarity. The deposits into Evan's shell company weren't random. They formed a pattern when arranged chronologically. The amounts increased gradually, then spiked, then leveled off. They resembled staged rounds of personal fundraising rather than income from legitimate work. The more alarming part came next. Alex had traced 2 of the incoming payments back to individuals who had filed small claims disputes in the past for unreturned investments. Nothing major, nothing publicly tied to Evan, but enough to show a connection between his private activity and disgruntled participants. It wasn't definitive evidence of wrongdoing, but it suggested a structure built on promises rather than outcomes. I sat still after reading the file, absorbing each detail with a calm focus that surprised even me. It wasn't just about exposing him anymore. It wasn't even about protecting my family from embarrassment, a concern I had long stopped carrying. It was about recognizing the harm he was capable of causing if no one intervened. A week before the wedding, the venue sent out a mass email reminding guests about the schedule. My sister forwarded it to the family group chat, adding a short message about dress code and parking instructions. I responded with a simple acknowledgement. She reacted with a thumbs up emoji. Nothing more. It was the most contact we'd had since the dinner. On the day of the rehearsal dinner, I received another file from Alex. This one contained something different, screenshots from an online forum where users discussed private investment opportunities. A profile that matched Evan's writing style appeared repeatedly promoting a project described with buzzwords but lacking transparent documentation. Some users praised him. Others questioned the legitimacy of his claims. One mentioned losing a significant amount of money. The post dated back nearly 2 years. That was enough. Not enough for authorities to act, not enough to accuse him publicly without context, but enough for me to understand the scale of what he was attempting to build and the danger my sister would be stepping into by tying her life to his. I didn't make a plan in the traditional sense. There were no long rehearsals, no dramatic build-up, no rehearsed monologue. I simply gathered everything. Every document, every inconsistency, every piece of information Alex uncovered and stored it in a single folder. Facts didn't need embellishment. They only needed the right moment. The wedding provided that moment. I placed the folder on my desk that evening, organized and ready. I didn't feel heroic, anxious, or vindictive. I felt steady, grounded by the understanding that truth doesn't require theatrics. It only requires timing. And when that timing arrived, I intended to be prepared. The wedding morning arrived with an odd stillness. I drove to the venue without urgency, following the long road toward the vineyard where the ceremony would take place. The sky hung low, a muted gray that didn't match the festive decorations lining the path. Guests moved in coordinated clusters, adjusting suits, smoothing dresses, laughing lightly. I walked alone, carrying nothing but a small clutch with the folder inside. It wasn't heavy, but its presence grounded me. The ceremony began without delay. My sister walked down the aisle looking radiant, hopeful, unaware. Evan stood waiting with practiced confidence, wearing a smile that seemed carved into place. Applause rose as she reached him. Vows were exchanged, rings slipped into place, cameras flashed. Everything unfolded smoothly, flawlessly, like a performance designed for a highlight reel. Then came the reception. Tables filled, glasses clinked, conversations overlapped. My parents floated through the room, greeting guests, beaming with pride. My sister and Evan made their entrance, receiving congratulations from every direction. They looked like the perfect couple, the perfect success story. And maybe that was why the timing felt right, because illusions are most vulnerable when people believe in them the most. I waited until the speeches were finished and guests began drifting toward the buffet. I walked toward the newly married couple with steady steps, not hurried, not hesitant. My sister saw me first. She looked surprised, almost relieved, as if my presence meant something good. Evan noticed only when I stopped in front of them. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't create a scene. I simply opened the folder and held it out. He glanced at the papers, then at me, confusion flashing across his face. My sister leaned in to see what I was showing him. Her expression shifted slowly, first curiosity, then confusion, then a stiffness that spread like frost. Inside the folder were documents Alex had verified: financial patterns, public filings, dispute summaries, forum screenshots. Nothing embellished, nothing speculative, just the truth arranged in clear order. Evan's demeanor cracked immediately. The confidence drained from his posture, replaced with a flicker of panic he couldn't mask. His mouth tightened, his cheeks flushed. He reached for excuses that fell apart before they could form. My sister stepped back slightly, her breathing uneven. Guests around us began noticing the tension, their conversations dimming into cautious murmurs. My parents approached, their expressions shifting from irritation to alarm when they saw the papers. I didn't explain, I didn't accuse, I didn't narrate his actions. I only said one sentence: calm, steady, undeniable. You should know who you married. The silence that followed was heavier than any confrontation I could have engineered. Evan's reaction did the rest. His defensiveness, his frantic attempts to dismiss the evidence, his failure to provide a coherent explanation. Each response revealed more than the documents themselves. My sister watched him unravel in real time, the polished mask she had fallen in love with collapsing in front of an entire room. My parents reacted exactly as I expected. They blamed me. My mother insisted I was trying to ruin the day. My father said I was making this about myself. Their words carried no surprise. They were echoes of every moment they had dismissed my perspective in favor of whoever stood taller, spoke louder, or projected certainty. I didn't stay to defend myself. I didn't wait for validation or apologies. I stepped away from the cluster forming around the couple, walked past the rows of tables, and headed toward the exit. No one followed me, not my parents, not my sister, not even Evan, who was too busy scrambling to salvage the image he had constructed. Outside, the air felt lighter. I reached my car, placed the now empty folder on the passenger seat, and sat for a moment, letting the sounds from the reception fade behind me. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel regret. What I felt was clarity. Sharp, clean, long overdue. Cutting ties wasn't dramatic. It wasn't painful. It was necessary. As I drove away, I understood something I spent years resisting. Sometimes the family you're born into isn't the one that protects you. Sometimes the role they assign you is too small for the person you actually are. And sometimes walking away isn't abandonment, it's self-respect. If you listened to my story all the way through, thank you for giving it your time. And before you go, tell me in the comments, what do you think is harder, speaking up or finally walking?